The intelligence report landed on Admiral Karl Dönitz's desk at Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin on the morning of November 12th, 1943. 3 pages of typed analysis, stamped with classifications that ensured only the highest command would read its contents. The subject line was clinical, bureaucratic. American Aircraft Carrier Production Assessment, 3rd quarter 1943. But the numbers inside those pages represented something far more devastating than mere statistics. They represented the mathematical proof that Germany had already lost the war at sea. 24 aircraft carriers. The report's author, a naval intelligence analyst who'd spent 2 years tracking American shipyard capacity, had documented the impossible. In just 18 months, American yards had launched 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, each displacing over 27,000 tons, each capable of operating 90 aircraft, each representing industrial capacity that exceeded Germany's entire annual steel production. Dönitz read the report 3 times, searching for the error, the misidentification, the intelligence failure that would explain how these numbers could exist in the same reality as Germany's strategic calculations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The error never appeared. The analyst had been thorough, cross-referencing launch dates from multiple sources, matching hull numbers to photographic reconnaissance, correlating diplomatic reports with signals intelligence. The 24 carriers were real, and behind them, American shipyards had another dozen under construction, their keels already laid, their completion dates projected with the casual confidence of a nation that treated aircraft carrier production the way Germany treated manufacturing trucks. Dönitz had built his career understanding naval mathematics, tonnage calculations, fuel consumption rates, the logistics of submarine warfare. These were puzzles with definite solutions. You counted your forces, measured your opponent's strength, and calculated whether the gap could be closed through tactical excellence or strategic innovation. But the Essex-class production numbers refused to fit into any equation that resulted in German victory. They represented a category of industrial capacity that transformed naval warfare from a contest between fleets into a race between entirely different economic systems. The Kriegsmarine had begun the war with 1 aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, never completed, never operational, abandoned in a shipyard as resources flowed to U-boats and surface raiders. Germany's naval aviation program had withered under Göring's Luftwaffe monopoly, starved of funding and institutional support until the concept of carrier-based air power became a theoretical exercise rather than operational capability. The absence had seemed acceptable in 1939 when Dönitz's U-boat doctrine promised to strangle Britain through commerce raiding, when surface engagement still followed predictable patterns established in the previous war. But by late 1943, the absence of German carrier aviation had evolved from tactical limitation to strategic catastrophe. The Atlantic U-boat campaign, which had nearly succeeded in cutting Britain's supply lines during 1942, had collapsed under the weight of Allied air cover. American escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls, provided air protection for convoys that once sailed vulnerable to submarine attack. British carrier groups hunted U-boats with airborne radar and depth charges that eliminated the underwater advantage German submariners had relied upon. And now the Essex-class program demonstrated that America's carrier production had moved beyond defensive necessity into offensive dominance that would reshape every theater of naval warfare. Dönitz turned to the report's appendix, where the analyst had included comparative production data. Germany's largest surface combatant currently under construction was a heavy cruiser displacing 12,000 tons, scheduled for completion in 1945, if steel allocations continued, which they wouldn't. The entire German shipbuilding industry, operating at maximum wartime capacity, produced roughly 300,000 tons of naval vessels annually. America's Essex-class program alone exceeded that figure, and the carriers represented just one element of American naval construction that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines emerging from yards that operated on scales incomprehensible to European industrial planners. The intelligence report documented specific vessels with the precision of a catalog. USS Essex, commissioned December 31st, 1942. USS Yorktown, commissioned April 15th, 1943, bearing the name of a carrier sunk at Midway just 10 months earlier. USS Intrepid, USS Hornet, USS Franklin, the names continued down the page, each representing a vessel that individually outweighed Germany's entire operational carrier capacity by infinite margins, since Germany's operational carrier capacity remained exactly zero, but the names mattered less than the intervals between launch dates. USS Lexington, commissioned February 17th, 1943. USS Bunker Hill, commissioned May 24, 1943. USS Wasp, commissioned November 24, 1943. The Americans were commissioning fleet carriers every 6 to 8 weeks, maintaining production rhythms that treated these massive warships as serialized products rather than unique strategic assets. Each carrier required approximately 15,000 tons of steel, 2,000 miles of electrical wiring, enough machinery to power a small city. And American yards produced them with the regularity of factories stamping out automobiles. Dönitz knew shipbuilding. He understood the complexity of naval construction, the thousands of specialized components, the skilled labor required for precision work, the months of fitting out that transformed a steel hull into an operational warship. The Essex-class production schedule defied every constraint that governed traditional shipyard operations. These weren't simplified emergency vessels like the Liberty ship merchantmen. These were sophisticated fleet carriers with armored flight decks, redundant damage control systems, advanced radar installations, and mechanical complexity that should have required years of construction time per vessel. The report's second section analyzed American shipyard organization, and here the intelligence picture became clearer, if no less devastating. American yards had abandoned traditional ship construction methods in favor of modular assembly techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Prefabricated sections built in separate facilities converged on final assembly docks where cranes lifted entire compartments into position. Welding teams worked around the clock, joining whole sections with speed that would have been impossible using riveting methods that still dominated European shipyards. The Americans had industrialized warship production, transforming naval construction from craft to manufacturing process. Newport News Shipbuilding produced Essex-class carriers alongside battleships and cruisers. Its facilities expanded to accommodate simultaneous construction of multiple capital ships. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard launched carriers while maintaining repair operations for battle-damaged vessels. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard added carrier production to its existing cruiser contracts. The distributed production model meant that no single facility represented a critical vulnerability, that damage to one yard would barely impact overall output, that American carrier construction could absorb losses and continue expanding. German strategic bombing had proven incapable of significantly disrupting British war production, despite years of sustained attacks. American industry, an ocean away from Luftwaffe range, operated in perfect security, its production schedules troubled only by labor disputes and resource allocation decisions rather than enemy action. The Kriegsmarine couldn't bomb American shipyards, couldn't interdict the raw materials flowing to their furnaces, couldn't prevent the completion of carriers that would hunt German submarines and protect invasion fleets that would carry American power to European shores. Dönitz had argued for months that Germany needed to disrupt American carrier production, that every Essex-class vessel commissioned represented a permanent shift in naval balance of power. But disruption required capabilities Germany didn't possess. Long-range bombers that could reach American industrial centers didn't exist in the Luftwaffe's inventory. Sabotage operations against American mainland targets had failed completely, discovered and neutralized by FBI counterintelligence before causing meaningful damage. The U-boat campaign, which might have threatened transatlantic supply lines, had been broken by convoy protection that included the very escort carriers whose construction the submarines were supposed to prevent. The strategic paradox was complete. Germany needed to stop American carrier production to win the Atlantic battle. But winning the Atlantic battle was the prerequisite for threatening American carrier production. And American carrier production was accelerating precisely because the Atlantic battle was turning decisively against German forces. The mathematics formed a closed loop with only one solution, and that solution involved German defeat. The report's third section examined operational implications, and here the analysts' clinical tone couldn't mask the desperation of Germany's position. Each Essex-class carrier operated an air group of 90 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. 24 carriers represented over 2,000 aircraft operating from mobile platforms that could appear anywhere in the Atlantic or Pacific. American carrier groups had already demonstrated their capability at Tarawa, where naval aviation had provided support for amphibious assaults against heavily defended positions. The same capability would soon turn toward Europe, where carrier-based aircraft could support invasion operations, hunt U-boats, and provide air cover for fleets that Germany had no capacity to challenge. The Bismarck, Germany's greatest surface combatant, had been hunted and destroyed by British carrier aircraft in May 1941. The lesson had been clear then. Naval aviation dominated surface warfare, and vessels without air cover operated at fatal disadvantage against opponents who controlled the skies. But Germany had failed to internalize the lesson, failed to develop carrier aviation, failed to recognize that naval supremacy in modern warfare required command of the air above the sea. Now, nearly 3 years later, American carrier production had reached levels that made German surface operations suicide. The Scharnhorst, pride of the remaining German battle fleet, couldn't sortie without facing carrier groups that would vector hundreds of aircraft against her. The Tirpitz, hidden in Norwegian fjords, remained trapped by British carrier patrols and the certain knowledge that American carrier groups would join the hunt if she attempted to break into the Atlantic. Germany's surface fleet had become museum pieces, strategically irrelevant because they operated in an environment completely dominated by naval aviation that Germany couldn't match. Dönitz closed the intelligence report and stared at the wall of his office, where maps tracked U-boat positions across the Atlantic. Red pins marked confirmed sinkings, clusters of losses concentrated along convoy routes where Allied air cover had become impenetrable. The Essex-class carriers would make those losses worse, extending air protection further into the mid-Atlantic gap, providing floating bases for anti-submarine patrols that would eliminate the last refugees where U-boats could operate with tactical advantage. The war at sea was ending, not through decisive battle, but through industrial asphyxiation. Germany couldn't build enough U-boats to replace combat losses, couldn't train enough crews to man the vessels that did reach completion, couldn't develop countermeasures fast enough to offset Allied technological advantages in radar, sonar, and airborne detection. And underlying all these tactical failures was the fundamental mathematical reality that America could build 24 fleet carriers in 18 months while Germany struggled to complete a single heavy cruiser. Admiral Erich Raeder Dönitz's predecessor as commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had resigned in January 1943 after losing a political battle with Hitler over surface fleet strategy. Raeder had argued for preserving Germany's remaining capital ships, husbanding resources for a future strategic opening that might justify risking them in combat. Hitler had demanded aggressive action, unwilling to accept that Germany's surface navy had become strategically impotent. Dönitz had inherited command knowing that the options available to the Kriegsmarine had narrowed to two choices: submarine warfare that was failing, or surface operations that were suicide. The intelligence report on Essex-class production suggested a third option that Dönitz couldn't officially acknowledge: acceptance of defeat at sea. Not surrender, not cessation of operations, but recognition that German naval forces could no longer prevent Allied maritime dominance, could no longer threaten supply lines connecting America to Europe, could no longer dispute control of sea lanes that would carry invasion fleets to continental shores. The analyst who'd compiled the report would never know if his work influenced strategic decisions. Intelligence assessments circulated through command hierarchies, informing decisions that remained classified, contributing to policy choices that couldn't be attributed to specific documents. But the numbers in the report would propagate through the Kriegsmarine's planning apparatus, shaping operational orders and resource allocations as commanders confronted the reality that American industrial capacity had transformed naval warfare into a contest Germany had lost before it began. November rain streaked the windows of Dönitz's office, Berlin weather turning cold and wet as autumn gave way to winter. Outside, the city continued its wartime routine, civilians queuing for rations, workers commuting to factories that produced weapons for armies fighting on fronts that stretched from Russia to Italy. The propaganda apparatus maintained its assurances of ultimate victory, of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of German will prevailing over material disadvantage. But inside the Kriegsmarine's headquarters, in offices where classified intelligence accumulated, a different truth was crystallizing. 24 Essex-class carriers in 18 months represented industrial capacity beyond German comprehension, beyond German ability to counter or match. The numbers were final, decisive, as deterministic as physics. And physics, unlike propaganda, couldn't be negotiated or reinterpreted. It simply described what was possible, and what was possible for America made German naval victory impossible. The Kriegsmarine's Naval Intelligence Section occupied 3 floors of a requisitioned office building in Berlin's government district, where analysts worked in rooms that smelled of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Brenner had commanded this section since early 1942, transforming a small liaison office into a comprehensive intelligence apparatus that tracked Allied naval construction with the obsessive detail of men who understood that accurate information represented Germany's only advantage against opponents with unlimited resources. Brenner's team consisted of 43 analysts, most of them former merchant marine officers or naval architects who could interpret technical specifications and construction timelines. They compiled data from multiple sources: signals, intelligence intercepts, diplomatic reports from neutral countries, photographic reconnaissance from long-range Condor flights, even American newspapers and trade publications that circulated through Sweden and Switzerland. The Americans, in their peculiar combination of operational security and democratic transparency, published enough information about their war production to give German intelligence a reasonably accurate picture of capabilities that should have remained classified. The Essex-class tracking file had grown to 3 binders by late 1943, each page documenting another carrier moving from keel, laying to launch to commissioning. Brenner maintained a wall chart in his office where colored pins marked each vessel's construction status: blue for keel laid, yellow for launched, red for commissioned. The chart had become a visual representation of German strategic failure, a rainbow of pins clustering around American shipyard locations, while the German section of the chart remained conspicuously empty. USS Ticonderoga, keel laid February 1st, 1943. USS Randolph, keel laid May 10th, 1943. USS Hancock, keel laid January 26, 1943. The intelligence summaries read like shipping manifests, clinical documentation of industrial processes that transformed raw steel into floating air bases at intervals that suggested American shipyards operated with supernatural efficiency. Brenner knew better. There was nothing supernatural about American production capacity. It was simply mathematics applied to manufacturing, resources allocated without the constraints that paralyzed German industry. His analysts had calculated the resource requirements for Essex-class construction with precision that would have impressed peacetime accountants. Each carrier required approximately 15,000 tons of steel plate, 4,000 tons of structural steel, 1,200 tons of armor plate. The electrical systems alone consumed enough copper wire to circle Berlin 3 times. Propulsion machinery included 4 sets of geared turbines, 8 boilers, generators capable of powering a town of 20,000 people. And these components arrived at shipyards in quantities that suggested American steel mills and machinery plants operated in some alternative economy where scarcity didn't exist. Germany's total steel production for 1943 would reach approximately 30 million tons, divided among weapons manufacturing, U-boat construction, armor production, and civilian necessities that couldn't be completely eliminated without social collapse. Building a single Essex-class carrier would consume roughly 0.05% of Germany's annual steel output. A manageable fraction if carrier construction was the only priority, but carrier construction wasn't the priority, could never be the priority, because Germany fought a ground war across Russia and a strategic bombing campaign over its cities and a submarine campaign in the Atlantic, each demanding steel allocations that left nothing for ambitious naval aviation programs. America's steel production for 1943 would exceed 90 million tons, triple Germany's output, with enough surplus capacity that building 24 fleet carriers barely registered as a significant allocation. The Americans could afford carrier construction because they could afford everything simultaneously: bomber production, tank manufacturing, Liberty ship assembly, while maintaining civilian automobile plants that could be converted to military production if actual shortages ever materialized. Brenner's background in merchant shipping gave him particular insight into the logistics miracle underlying American carrier production. Steel didn't simply appear at shipyards through magic. It traveled from mills in Pittsburgh and Gary, transported by rail networks that moved millions of tons monthly without strain. Armor plate came from specialized foundries that had expanded production to meet naval contracts. Turbines and boilers arrived from manufacturers who'd converted peacetime capacity to wartime requirements. The entire industrial ecosystem functioned with integration that Germany had attempted and failed to achieve, coordination that required infrastructure investment and organizational capacity beyond what a nation fighting for survival could maintain. The intelligence files documented specific American shipyards with the thoroughness of military targeting studies. Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company occupied over 900 acres of waterfront property in Virginia, employing 31,000 workers across 3 shifts that operated continuously. The facility included 12 building ways, 4 dry docks, its own steel fabrication plant, and electrical generation capacity sufficient to power the operation independently of civilian grid. Newport News had launched 5 Essex-class carriers by November 1943, with 3 more under construction, maintaining production schedules that treated fleet carriers as routine output rather than generational projects. Bethlehem Steel's Fore River Shipyard in Massachusetts had expanded from 1,500 employees in 1939 to 20,000 by 1943. Its workforce transformed through training programs that converted inexperienced laborers into welders and fitters within weeks. The shipyard had pioneered modular construction techniques that allowed simultaneous work on multiple vessel sections, reducing construction time from traditional 30-month timelines to 16 months for Essex-class carriers. German yards still built ships sequentially, each component fitted individually by craftsmen whose skills couldn't be replicated through abbreviated training. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard represented government ownership applied to industrial production. Its facilities expanded through federal funding that treated capital investment as strategic necessity rather than budget constraint. The yard employed 25,000 workers, operated its own steel mill, and maintained construction capacity for carriers, battleships, and cruisers simultaneously. By late 1943, Philadelphia had launched 3 Essex-class carriers while conducting repair operations on battle-damaged vessels returning from Pacific operations. The distributed production model meant that American carrier construction had no single point of failure. Bombing one yard if German forces possessed the capability to conduct strategic strikes against American mainland targets would reduce carrier production by perhaps 15%, while the remaining yards absorbed additional contracts and expanded operations. Germany's shipyard capacity, concentrated in vulnerable coastal facilities within range of Allied bombers, represented a strategic liability that worsened as the war continued, and Allied air superiority made any coastal installation a potential target. Brenner had submitted multiple reports analyzing the strategic impossibility of disrupting American carrier production through military action. The Atlantic was an Allied lake by late 1943, dominated by convoy protection and anti-submarine patrols that made U-boat operations suicidal outside narrow operational windows. Surface raiders couldn't threaten American shipping lanes without facing overwhelming retaliation from carrier groups and battleship formations. Strategic bombing remained fantasy, since German aircraft couldn't reach American industrial centers, and Allied air defenses would annihilate any force that attempted the crossing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The only option for preventing American carrier dominance had been diplomatic. Political settlement before industrial mobilization transformed theoretical American capacity into operational fleets. But that option had expired on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States, in misguided solidarity with an ally who'd just awakened an industrial giant. By late 1943, nearly 2 years after American entry into the war, the Essex-class production numbers documented the cost of that strategic miscalculation. Brenner's analysts tracked not just carrier hulls, but also the air groups that would operate from their decks. Each Essex-class carrier embarked approximately 90 aircraft organized in groups that included fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. 24 carriers represented over 2,000 aircraft operating from mobile platforms that could appear anywhere in the Atlantic or Pacific. American aircraft production exceeded German output by ratios that made sustainable air operations impossible for Luftwaffe units that faced constant attrition without adequate replacement. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, which equipped Essex-class carrier air groups, entered production in October 1942. By November 1943, Grumman had delivered over 2,500 Hellcats to the Navy, with monthly production rates approaching 400 aircraft. Germany's primary fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, achieved production rates of roughly 350 aircraft monthly across all variants, divided between Eastern Front operations, Western Front defense, and Mediterranean theater commitments. American carrier air groups could absorb combat losses that would cripple German fighter squadrons, because replacement aircraft arrived faster than pilots could be lost. The Americans had solved the production equation that Germany never managed, creating sustainable cycles of manufacture and deployment that allowed offensive operations without depleting strategic reserves. Each Essex-class carrier represented not just a floating airbase, but a complete tactical ecosystem designed for independent operations across oceanic distances. The intelligence files documented Essex-class capabilities with specifications gleaned from technical publications and photographic analysis. Flight deck length, 872 feet, sufficient for simultaneous launch and recovery. Operations, hangar deck capacity, enough space for complete air group maintenance and rearmament. Defensive armament, quad 40mm anti-aircraft guns, twin 20mm mounts, radar-directed fire control that could engage attacking aircraft at ranges where human gunners couldn't acquire targets. But the specifications mattered less than the operational concept they embodied. Essex-class carriers were designed for sustained combat operations far from friendly bases, their internal fuel capacity sufficient for 30,000 nautical mile range, their magazines stocked with enough aviation ordnance to support weeks of continuous airstrikes. They operated as mobile fortresses, self-sufficient cities that could project air power across thousands of miles without logistical dependence on vulnerable supply lines. The Kriegsmarine had no counter to this capability. Germany's abandoned carrier program had envisioned vessels operating in narrow European waters, dependent on land-based air cover and proximity to friendly ports. The Graf Zeppelin, if completed, would have displaced 23,000 tons and operated 40 aircraft. Respectable numbers by European standards, but inadequate against American designs that treated carrier aviation as the primary naval weapon rather than supplementary support for surface actions. Brenner had been present at the strategic conference in January 1943 when Admiral Raeder attempted to explain to Hitler why Germany needed to abandon surface ship construction in favor of U-boat production. Raeder had brought charts showing Allied carrier strength and projections of American construction capacity. Hitler had interrupted repeatedly, demanding to know why German shipyards couldn't match American production, why German engineering couldn't develop superior designs, why defeatist thinking infected naval command. The conference had ended with Raeder's resignation and Dönitz's promotion to commander-in-chief, but the fundamental strategic reality hadn't changed. Germany couldn't match American carrier production because Germany lacked the steel, the shipyard capacity, the industrial infrastructure, and the strategic breathing room to develop naval aviation while fighting ground wars across 2 continents. The choice wasn't between building carriers or building U-boats. The choice was between building U-boats that might disrupt some fraction of Allied shipping or building nothing at all while American industrial capacity rendered German naval resistance irrelevant. By December 1943, the intelligence picture had clarified to the point where analysis became redundant. American carrier construction would continue accelerating through 1944 and beyond. Producing vessels faster than combat operations could damage them, creating numerical superiority so overwhelming that tactical excellence became strategically meaningless. The Kriegsmarine could sink individual carriers, might achieve tactical victories through submarine ambushes or surface engagements. But these successes would be immediately negated by replacement vessels emerging from American shipyards on predictable monthly schedules. The Essex-class program represented industrial warfare refined to its purest form. Not artistry, not engineering brilliance, not tactical innovation, but simple, relentless production that transformed quantity into quality through the mathematical certainty that overwhelming numbers eventually prevail against any opposition. 24 carriers in 18 months demonstrated that America had solved the fundamental equation of modern warfare. Victory belonged to whoever could build faster than their opponent could destroy. Brenner compiled his final assessment in a document that would circulate among Kriegsmarine senior staff but never reach wider distribution. The conclusions were too stark for general consumption, too definitive in their acknowledgement of strategic defeat. American carrier construction capacity exceeds German ability to interdict or counter through available military means, the assessment stated. Current production rates suggest American carrier strength will reach 40 to 50 fleet carriers by end of 1944, representing air power projection capability against which German naval forces cannot operate effectively. The document continued with detailed analysis, but the essential conclusion appeared in its opening paragraph. The war at sea was over, decided not by battles or tactics or strategic genius, but by industrial mathematics that admitted no subjective interpretation. America could build carriers faster than Germany could sink them, and that simple fact rendered every other naval calculation irrelevant. The operational reality of American carrier dominance manifested most clearly in the Pacific theater, where intelligence reports documented Essex-class vessels transforming naval warfare through sustained offensive operations that would have been impossible for any previous fleet. Brenner's analysts tracked each carrier's combat debut with the attention of scholars studying an emerging tactical doctrine, noting how American forces employed their numerical superiority to overwhelm Japanese defenses through continuous pressure rather than decisive single engagements. USS Essex herself, the class namesake, had entered combat operations in August 1943 during raids against Marcus Island. Her air group delivered strikes that destroyed ground installations and demonstrated the carrier's capability to operate at extended range from Pearl Harbor. Within 3 months, Essex participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign, providing air support for amphibious assaults on Tarawa that showcased carrier aviation's role in modern combined arms operations. The vessel that had been commissioned just 8 months earlier was already a combat veteran, her crew experienced in operations that Japanese forces had spent years perfecting. But Essex operated as part of a carrier task force that included Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Independence, 4 fleet carriers concentrating air power that exceeded the entire Japanese carrier strength committed to the Gilbert's campaign. American tactical doctrine had evolved beyond individual vessel operations to integrated task force employment, where multiple carriers provided redundant capability and overwhelming numerical advantage. If one carrier suffered damage or required replenishment, 3 others continued operations without degradation in offensive capacity. The intelligence reports reaching Berlin documented this new operational reality with statistics that revealed the futility of traditional naval calculations. During the Tarawa operation, American carrier aircraft flew over 700 sorties in 3 days, delivering ordnance tonnages that exceeded what land-based bombers could achieve, while maintaining flexibility to respond to emerging tactical requirements. Japanese defenders faced continuous air attack from platforms they couldn't locate or engage, since carrier task forces maneuvered beyond range of land-based aircraft, while their own air groups struck with impunity. Korvettenkapitän Brenner understood that the Pacific War was providing a preview of what Atlantic operations would look like once American carrier strength reached sufficient levels to support European offensives. The amphibious assaults on Italian beaches during September 1943 had included escort carrier support, smaller vessels converted from merchant hulls, but the Essex-class carriers now entering service would bring fleet carrier capabilities to European waters, their air groups able to provide coverage for invasion forces that Germany lacked the naval aviation to contest. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. Each Essex-class carrier represented not just current combat capability, but future expansion potential. American shipyards continued laying keels for additional vessels, while earlier completions entered service, creating a production pipeline that ensured continuous growth in carrier strength, regardless of combat losses. The USS Intrepid, commissioned in August 1943, joined the fleet just as USS Hancock's keel was being laid at Bethlehem Fall River. By the time Hancock commissioned in April 1944, 2 more keels would be laid, perpetuating cycles of construction that treated carrier production as sustainable industrial output rather than emergency mobilization. Germany possessed no equivalent production capacity, no shipyards capable of serial carrier construction, no industrial base that could support simultaneous manufacture of multiple fleet carriers while maintaining U-boat production and surface vessel construction. The Graf Zeppelin, begun in December 1936, remained incomplete in 1943. Her construction suspended and resumed multiple times as resources shifted between competing priorities. 7 years to not complete a single carrier, while American yards launched 24 in 18 months. The comparison required no analysis. It simply documented industrial capacity gaps that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The winter of 1943 brought new intelligence that confirmed the most pessimistic projections. American carrier construction was accelerating rather than plateauing. USS Franklin commissioned in January 1944. USS Ticonderoga followed in May. USS Randolph in October. The intervals between commissioning dates remained consistent, suggesting American shipyards had achieved sustainable production rhythms that could continue indefinitely as long as steel and labor remained available. And American steel production showed no signs of constraint, while labor forces expanded through training programs that converted civilian workers into shipyard employees within weeks. Brenner's staff calculated that by the end of 1944, American carrier strength would include at least 32 Essex-class fleet carriers, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers, representing over 3,000 carrier-based aircraft operating from mobile platforms distributed across Pacific and Atlantic theaters. The Kriegsmarine's entire combat aviation capability consisted of approximately 200 aircraft operating from land bases, inadequate for contesting even a single American carrier task force, much less the integrated fleet operations that American doctrine emphasized. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided definitive demonstration of what American carrier numerical superiority meant in combat. Brenner received intelligence summaries within weeks of the engagement, reports compiled from Japanese communications intercepts and neutral observer accounts. The American Fifth Fleet had deployed 15 carriers, including 7 Essex-class vessels, against a Japanese force of 9 carriers. The numerical advantage alone suggested American victory, but the battle's outcome exceeded anything predictable from simple ship counts. American carrier aircraft destroyed approximately 400 Japanese planes while losing fewer than 30 of their own. 3 Japanese carriers sank, their air groups annihilated by American fighters that operated with technological and numerical advantages Japanese forces couldn't counter. The engagement demonstrated that American carrier operations had evolved beyond quantity into integrated systems where radar-directed fighter control, superior aircraft performance, and overwhelming numbers created tactical dominance so complete that Japanese skill and courage became strategically irrelevant. The intelligence assessment Brenner prepared emphasized the systematic nature of American victory. This wasn't luck or exceptional performance. This was industrial capacity applied to naval warfare, where American forces could afford to lose aircraft and pilots because replacement training programs graduated aviators faster than combat consumed them, where carriers damaged in action could be repaired while sister ships maintained operational tempo, where ammunition and fuel logistics supported sustained operations that Japanese forces couldn't match due to resource constraints that worsened daily. Admiral Dönitz read Brenner's assessment during a command conference in July 1944, 2 weeks after the Philippine Sea engagement. The conference room in Berlin was hot. Summer heat made worse by inadequate ventilation and the press of bodies around tables covered with maps that showed contracting German positions on every front. The Eastern Front consumed divisions faster than replacement training could produce them. The Western Front had exploded on June 6th with Allied landings in Normandy, supported by naval forces that included escort carriers and battleships that German coastal defenses couldn't seriously threaten. And now Brenner's report documented that the war at sea had reached a conclusion as definitive as any land battle. American carrier strength had achieved levels where German naval operations became exercises in futility, where U-boats faced air patrols they couldn't evade, where surface vessels risked annihilation if they sortied beyond coastal waters. The mathematics admitted no optimistic interpretation. 24 Essex-class carriers in 18 months, with production continuing, represented industrial victory so complete that tactical responses became irrelevant. The Tirpitz, Germany's last operational battleship, remained trapped in Norwegian fjords, immobilized by British carrier patrols, and the certain knowledge that attempting a breakout would result in coordinated airstrikes from carriers that could concentrate overwhelming force within hours. The vessel that Hitler had proclaimed invincible had become a static coastal defense battery, strategically useless because operating in an environment where American and British carrier aviation controlled the seas. Dönitz had accepted command of the Kriegsmarine knowing that strategic options had narrowed to desperate measures. By mid-1944, even desperate measures offered no realistic path to affecting the war's outcome. The U-boat campaign had been broken by convoy protection that included escort carriers, destroyers equipped with advanced sonar, and long-range patrol aircraft operating from bases throughout the Atlantic. German submarines still sank Allied vessels, still achieved tactical successes, but at casualty rates that made each patrol a probable death sentence for crews who understood they fought battles Germany had already lost. The Essex-class carriers would make even these marginal successes impossible once American carrier groups began. Atlantic patrols, fleet carriers operating in anti-submarine roles, represented inefficient allocation of resources, like using sledgehammers to crack walnuts. But America could afford inefficiency because industrial capacity made resource constraints irrelevant. If dedicating Essex-class carriers to Atlantic patrol eliminated U-boat operations entirely, American planners would make that allocation without concern for opportunity costs. Brenner's intelligence section tracked individual Essex-class vessels through their combat careers, documenting operational patterns that revealed American tactical doctrine. Carriers rotated between frontline operations and rear area replenishment on schedules that maintained continuous combat presence while allowing battle-damaged vessels time for repair and refit. USS Yorktown participated in the Philippine Sea Battle, withdrew for replenishment, and returned to operations within 3 weeks. USS Hornet supported operations at Palau, sustained minor damage from anti-aircraft fire, underwent repairs at Ulithi that took 10 days, and resumed combat operations without missing scheduled strikes. The operational tempo suggested that American logistics had solved problems that paralyzed German naval forces. Carriers required enormous quantities of aviation fuel, ordnance,
spare parts, and provisions for crews of over 3,000 men. Supporting 15 carriers in sustained operations demanded supply networks that could deliver thousands of tons of material across oceanic distances on predictable schedules. American fleet trains included specialized vessels for every requirement, oilers that transferred fuel at sea, ammunition ships that replenished magazines without returning to port, repair vessels that conducted maintenance in forward anchorages. Germany's remaining surface vessels stayed in port for months, awaiting fuel allocations, spare parts that couldn't be manufactured due to industrial bombing, maintenance that required facilities the Allies systematically destroyed. The contrast documented fundamental differences in how the opposing sides approached naval warfare. Americans treated logistics as the foundation of operations, building supply systems first, and then conducting campaigns those systems could support. Germans conducted operations and hoped logistics would somehow accommodate tactical requirements, an approach that had worked during early war years when campaigns concluded before supply lines collapsed. But that failed catastrophically as the war extended beyond Germany's logistical capacity to sustain. The intelligence files documented one final detail that completed Brenner's understanding of how thoroughly Germany had lost the naval war. American carrier construction costs, compiled from congressional budget reports and industry publications, revealed that Essex-class vessels cost approximately $78 million each. 24 carriers represented total investment of roughly $1.87 billion, a sum that exceeded Germany's entire naval construction budget for the war's duration. But American carrier construction represented just one element of naval spending that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and the thousands of support vessels that sustained fleet operations. Total American naval construction for 1943 exceeded $8 billion, more than Germany spent on its entire military establishment. The financial comparison documented economic capacity gaps as decisive as industrial production disparities. Germany couldn't outspend America, couldn't outproduce America, couldn't develop technologies or tactics that offset advantages rooted in fundamental economic superiority. The Essex-class program demonstrated that modern warfare had become an industrial competition where victory belonged to nations that could manufacture weapons faster than opponents could destroy them. And in that competition, Germany had been defeated before the first shot was fired. The files that documented Essex-class construction would remain classified for decades after the war. Bureaucratic records of intelligence assessments that influenced strategic decisions without determining them. Brenner continued compiling reports through 1944 and into 1945, tracking additional carriers as they commissioned. USS Bon Homme Richard, USS Leyte, USS Kearsarge, the names continuing until total Essex-class construction reached 24 vessels completed during the war, with more under construction when hostilities ended. But the strategic conclusions those reports supported had crystallized by late 1943, when the initial production numbers documented industrial capacity beyond German comprehension or capability to counter. 24 carriers in 18 months represented more than naval construction statistics. They represented the mathematical proof that Germany had lost the war at sea, that American industrial mobilization had achieved levels where German resistance became strategically meaningless, that tactics and courage and national will mattered less than the simple, overwhelming fact of American production capacity. Admiral Dönitz would continue prosecuting the naval war through Germany's final collapse, ordering U-boat patrols that achieved nothing beyond adding names to casualty lists, maintaining surface vessels that never left port, defending strategic positions that no longer mattered. The Kriegsmarine fought on because surrender wasn't a choice German command could accept, while the nation still fielded forces.
But the intelligence assessments documenting Essex-class production told a different story, one that admitted no revision through determination or sacrifice. The story was simple, definitive, as mathematical as physics. America had built 24 fleet carriers in 18 months, while Germany built none. American shipyards continued launching carriers on predictable schedules, while German yards struggled to complete individual vessels. American carrier air groups flew thousands of sorties, while German naval aviation existed as bureaucratic fiction. And these facts, documented in intelligence files that circulated through Kriegsmarine headquarters, represented final verdict on naval warfare conducted between industrial economies of fundamentally different scales. The war would continue another year, consuming millions more lives, destroying cities, displacing populations. But the naval outcome had been determined by production statistics compiled in late 1943, when analysts like Korvettenkapitän Brenner documented that American shipyards had achieved sustained carrier construction at rates that made German strategic resistance mathematically impossible. The Essex-class program hadn't just changed naval balance of power. It had demonstrated that modern warfare was decided by industrial capacity, and in that competition, Germany had lost before it began. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.